Hey, business law students. I hope everything is going well back in Roscommon. I am recording this video from my parents' house again in Big Rapids. And I didn't want to go another day without seeing you guys or just giving you guys some busy work to work on. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and get out the employment laws lecture that we have been going over. And I'm just going to review the last part of that, the 1960, well, excuse me, review the last part that we covered, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and then go into a few more. There's a video when this is over that I'm gonna have you guys watch about age discrimination. And that should be it. So probably about, I don't know, about 30 minutes of me lecturing and you guys taking some notes down. And at the very end, I'm going to talk about an assignment that I want you to do asynchronously tomorrow, Friday. And yeah, that's what we're going to cover today. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and you will see the slideshow we left off on. And just as a quick reminder, let's see if we can get this going here. Some of you are absent and others of you saw this part of the lecture, but I'm just going to quickly review these slides. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, probably one of the most important employment law acts. Oh, by the way, you know, we're kind of going between unions and union law and the employment law lecture that I had started more than a week ago. So if you're getting confused, it's all about employment law. This particular slideshow is all about the different laws themselves. And then the union stuff we'll be wrapping up hopefully Monday when I see you. We'll finish up that video. We'll also go over the article reviews that I'm going to be assigning to you tomorrow. And yeah, so that's where we're going with this. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right in front of you. Race, religion, national origin, color, and sex or gender, which, as you can see there, does include sexual harassment. Also, part of the discussion should be Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is a subsection which addresses the concept of affirmative action. Affirmative action, if you haven't heard of it, is this idea that because of past discrimination, not just against races, but all of these categories, race and sex and national origin and so forth, that businesses and employers would be held to a standard of attempting to fix that past discrimination by giving priority or giving preference to minorities in the hiring practices. And so, for example, if the geographic location that you are is 50% white, 50% African American, you know, this is just going to be a very simple example. And let's say you own a factory that's in that geographic area, and your factory is 80% white and 20% black, then you would be required to take affirmative action to attempt to fix those proportions. I'm not saying necessarily that you have been discriminatory in the past. That's very difficult to prove, but that you should be taking affirmative steps, proactive steps to try and improve the ratio of minorities or blacks that are under your employment. So if you had a white candidate who was qualified, a black candidate who is qualified, but even if the white candidate is more qualified, you'd be justified. Title VII would say that we would prefer that you hired the black, the minority, to improve these ratios. So affirmative action doesn't just include workplaces, but also college admissions and a few other things that we're not going to really get into at this point. But You hear a lot about it with college admissions, and again, it was brought about to try and address the past discrimination and to give a leg up to minorities and women to have a little bit of advantage or preference in hiring practice. So we call that affirmative action. And some people think of affirmative action as reverse discrimination, discrimination against the majority, whites. And one could make that argument. However, some states have addressed the issue of affirmative action and struck down parts of the law, but it's still something that's part of the federal law. So it's tough to prove, but it is part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So the 5 protected classes, you have to fall into one of these classes. And when we last saw each other, I had started already past this slide in describing what some of these things were, and that some people don't know the difference between, for example, race and national origin. What's the difference between race and color? Aren't those the same thing? So we're going to kind of address those here real quick. So again, some of you have already seen this slide. Which person is American, and you can't really judge national origin by somebody's looks. We don't know if the black gentleman is from America or Canada or Germany or where he's from. And so back in the day, any kind of discrimination based on national origin, you don't see it as much anymore. But it'd be kind of like, for example, if you don't like somebody who is of Iraqi descent because we've been to war with Iraq, or Iranian descent, or Russian descent, or whatever. So back in the day, it was really the Irish, more than 100 years ago, the Irish who were Caucasian. You couldn't really tell the difference between, an Irishman and a German person, a German immigrant. But once you found out that guy was Irish, sometimes they would just blatantly discriminate and say, we don't hire Irish. So that would be based on national origin. Just for curiosity, the gal on the left is Christy Yamaguchi. She's an American gold medal winning figure skater for the United States in the Olympics. Gentleman in the middle is a German race car driver, and the African-American gentleman is from the United States, Sidney Poitier. He was the first Black actor to win the Academy Award for Best Actor. So here's another term, and I always teach in my sociology class that the term African-American is used by the media and is politically correct, but really it's not correct. It's not a good designation of race, although we use it as a designation of race. It's a designation of national origin is what it is. And so, for example, if I were to ask a question, which is African-American? Gentleman on the left is Ben Johnson. He is Canadian. So how can you call a Canadian African-American? He's African-Canadian, again, but his race, his genetics are rooted from Africa. The blonde gal at the top, that's Charlize Theron. She's an American actress. She was originally from South Africa. She was born in South Africa, the country of South Africa, which is in the continent of Africa. So she is African American. Isn't that funny? She is African American, but she's not Black. So she is an American citizen. She went through the naturalization process. So she is American, and she is of African descent. So she would be African American. The two on the bottom, that's an older picture of Michael Jackson, the singer, Michael Jackson's kids. And they have a white mother and a Michael Jackson, African American, a Black musician who's now dead, but he was their father. And so you see their skin tone is very, very light. And they don't carry a lot of the genetic characteristics of an African, somebody of African descent. So it's very difficult to tell. Tiger Woods, okay, up on the top right, he's been called black, a black golfer. His mother is a combination of Asian and some other things. His father was black and white. His grandparents were, one was white, one was black. And I think I saw in the documentary recently that he was referring to his race as Caucasian or something like that, Caucasian, black, and Asian. And so multiracial. So really distinctions of race are becoming more and more obsolete because of biracial mixed races. And so this was once something that was needed to be protected against, and to a certain extent still, but this is something that you're going to see that eventually will start to go away. These are my kids and myself, you see, and I had mentioned this the other day in class, Korean American. So on the far right, that's my son Bailey when he was probably in about middle school, I think. Picture of me and my daughter when she was in high school, and she's now a school teacher. Bottom left-hand corner, he's probably the most Caucasian Asian you've ever seen. That's my nephew, Nick. And my son, Casey, in the top left with two of his friends from Korean camp. And so they're all Korean American. They're all American citizens of Korean descent. I think I told the story once where we were filling out the census. It was the 2010 census. 11 years ago, and they were asking a question of all the family members. How many Caucasians in the household? How many blacks? How many Pacific Islanders? How many Asians? And I just went around the table at our dinner table and said, okay, Casey, what do you want to be? You want to be Caucasian or do you want to be Asian? Jordan, what do you want to be? Caucasian or Asian? You can be whatever you want to be. And so it's physical characteristics, but it's also somewhat made up because everybody pretty much is of mixed race. Religion is another protected class. Back in the day, it was more Catholic. In the United States, it was more Catholics and Protestants. Catholics discriminating against Protestants and vice versa. Today we see discrimination against Muslims, for example, or Jews. And so I like using this picture. The one on the right is a former congressman of Michigan, Dave Camp. He's a Christian. The one on the left is one of the few black Jews you ever see in your life. He was an entertainer. His name was Sammy Davis Jr., and he's now dead. But this picture was probably from the 80s, and he's Jewish. Yeah, and you can't really tell by looking at somebody what their religion is. So, what is race? Is it about the skin color, the texture of your hair, eye shape, between, for example, there's the little alarm going off. Physical characteristics. It's all about physical characteristics, what race is. And sociologists for many decades had basically said there's 5 world races. And races is not a true construct, although you can find genetics of, for example, people of African descent and Caucasian or European descent. This is what they came up with, but this is not really accurate. So Mongoloid is a term, and again, these are to be scientific terms, all right? Mongoloid is what we would refer to as Asian, Caucasoid, white, Negroid, black, or African, Capoid, which is going to be your Southern African, the Bushmen, for example. and Australoid, Aborigines of Australia, the original inhabitants of Australia. And remember, I sometimes get students that will kind of flinch when I say Negroid. But if you have studied Spanish or French or Latin, negra, negro is black, and the word for black. And so these are not bad words. Now, bad words have come from these words, words that we try to avoid, politically incorrect words. However, Negroid is totally appropriate to refer to somebody of African descent. Here's a kind of a picture of each, and you see the capoid bushman. I think Patrick had mentioned how maybe politically incorrect that term might be. Okay, so I talked a little bit about religion. There's another word you might also see, and the word is creed. Creed is your belief system, but it may not be tied to religion. And so you can't discriminate based on somebody's creed. So for example, we're seeing a lot of creed falling into political persuasion discrimination. If somebody's a very vocal or outspoken Republican and they are at a workplace that is very democratic, and to discriminate against the Republican might be a discrimination based on creed or vice versa. And so religion, creed, it basically gets down to your belief system. And now, key word here, key term, BFOQ. BFOQ stands for bona fide occupational qualification. You're going to need to understand that. I really can't overstate that. BFOQs are exceptions, places where you are allowed to discriminate. But what bona fide occupational qualification means is like there's a legitimate reason to discriminate against a particular person. So, for example, if we were going to use religion, let's say you're a Catholic church and you are hiring, and in your job application, you basically say you have to be Catholic. We discriminate against Protestants, Jews, Muslims, etc., etc. And a church might make a very good argument that you'd have to be Catholic to be the Catholic Church secretary. Now, maybe you could prove that you don't have to necessarily, but you're going to want the secretary to know and understand all the religious doctrine, the belief systems, and so forth. Or if you're hiring, well, probably wouldn't be a Catholic priest, but a Protestant priest or a Protestant pastor. All right, you obviously can discriminate against somebody who might be Jewish that's applying for that job. Why they would apply for that job, I don't know, but it's a bona fide occupational qualification. It's a legitimate reason. One of the easiest ways to explain this is if you are a movie production company and you are hiring for the role of Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. Can we discriminate against men? Yeah, absolutely. It's a bona fide occupational qualification. You have to be a female to play this role. Now, we could get into transgender and some of those sorts of things, and that does complicate the issue. But if we're going to go from a traditional standpoint, a bona fide occupational qualification allows you to discriminate in certain areas if you can prove that that job can only be done by a certain race, religion, color, national origin, whatever the protected class might be. Let's see, another bona fide occupational qualification. And bona fide occupational qualifications aren't always related to protected classes. They could be things like somebody once said, to be a fireman, if you're going to be a fire department and you want to make it so all firemen must be able to climb a ladder with 50 pounds on their back and do it in under 60 seconds, all right, That's a bona fide occupational qualification, and you test an applicant for that job. If they can do it, great. If they can't do it, then you can legitimately say, we're not going to hire you. Now, one argument could be made that maybe there's more male firemen over female firemen. It isn't necessarily that the fire department's being discriminatory against females, but they have a bona fide occupational qualification that does end up disqualifying a lot of females. Now, it must be bona fide. It can't be something that you're going to set that you know is not something that is related to doing that job. And so, for example, if they, so for a fire department, climbing a ladder with 50 pounds on your pack it's bona fide occupational qualification. Nobody would question that. But what about a plumber? Okay. Now, one could say, well, every now and then a plumber's got to climb up a ladder and carry tools up that ladder. And if you are a sexist plumbing company and you wanted to not hire any females, you might come up with some sort of occupational qualification like that isn't necessarily bona fide. It's going to exclude, you'll end up being discriminatory. It's going to exclude a lot of females, but at the same time, you know, a female who wanted to take that to court could say, but plumbers rarely climb ladders. I mean, maybe once every several years might they get a job where they have to climb up to the roof of something to fix plumbing, you know. And so it has to be a legitimate reason. We actually had we had one of those types of jobs in Roscommon schools many years ago. We don't anymore, but Mr. Patterson, Mr. Dalek, gym teachers, they're males. We have a female locker room, and way back in the day, they don't do this anymore, but way back in the day, we could require, and for gym class, we could require after gym class is over, everybody gets in the shower, takes a shower before you go to and get graded on that. You know, if you didn't participate, you didn't take a shower after gym class, you were marked down. And so if you have male gym teachers, who was going to do that? So we actually hired a female locker room attendant quite a few years back. And the requirement was that the applicant had to be a female. It was a bona fide occupational qualification. And so we could legitimately discriminate against males in that particular job. So, okay, national origin. And, you know, again, it's not as big a deal anymore. It was a lot more prevalent earlier in this century, in the previous century, a lot of discrimination based on where somebody was from. And I mentioned that there was a lot of, excuse me, a lot of discrimination against the Irish back in the day. Color, and again, this isn't as much an issue anymore. But even within, you know, specific racial groups, blacks, for example, you can have some fairly light skin black, very dark skin black. You might have a workplace that is mostly African American, and they maybe were mostly light skinned, and they were discriminating against darker skinned African Americans. And so that's where color, the protected class color, would come into play. You know, can you discriminate against your own race? You know, that one might be a defense in a lawsuit argument, but we do have color, the darkness of your skin. If you can somehow prove that you were discriminated against because of the darkness or the lightness or the color, whatever color of your skin, and that would be discrimination based on color. Gender, pretty self-explanatory, males and females. Generally, the discrimination is males against females, but it could be the other way around. There could be male discrimination. For example, video you're going to watch is going to mention, and I'm going to mention in a few slides, a very, very famous case, Hooters restaurants. Some males wanted to be Hooters waitresses or waiters, and were discriminated against. And Hooters was basically using the BFOQ argument, bona fide occupational qualification argument. Our customers are a certain percentage male, let's say 90% male, 95% male, and they come into our restaurants because of our female waitresses, as their name suggests. Secretaries, for example, flight attendants, these are other areas where males might be discriminated against due to their gender. But generally, it's male discrimination against female gender. And by the way, you see a YouTube link there. There'll probably be a video for you to watch after this is over. Sexual orientation. So I've made this slideshow probably 5-8 years ago, and the laws in this area and transgender LGBTQ area are constantly evolving year to year. And so my slide, you don't need to write down any of these states, but my slide could be a little off. But what you do need to understand is that still there is no federal protection. Sexual orientation is not a protected class federally across the entire United States. Many states have protected sexual orientation, whether you're gay or not, all right, or bisexual, whatever sexual orientation you might be. Michigan, for example, was a state that had not had any of these protections. And I remember a case when I was going through college, a Cracker Barrel restaurant case down in Belleville, Michigan, down near Detroit. A gay gentleman was fired for being gay, and he sued, and he lost. The outcome of that case was that, hey, there are no federal protections for being gay. And in Michigan at the time, there was no protection for being gay. And so this is slowly evolving. I will be willing to bet at some point in our future, maybe under the Biden administration, you'll see that change. Age discrimination. This is one that sounds like it should be obvious, but at the same time, maybe not. But basically, the Age Discrimination Act protects employees that are age 40 and up from age discrimination. And I'm going to have you watch a YouTube video after this lecture is over, and it's a pretty interesting video. It actually argues the opposite side, that maybe this shouldn't be a protected class, but right now it is, of course, a protected class. If your employer says, we're firing you because you're too old, that is something that you could sue your employer over. Rather than saying, hey, you can do the job, or can you do the job, can you not do the job? That would be a BFOQ. If I said, you're a fireman, you got to be able to climb this ladder. In my previous example, you got to climb this ladder in a certain amount of time. Many 60-year-olds won't be able to do that. So rather than saying, we're not hiring you because you're 60, that would be age discrimination. They can say, we're not hiring you because you can't climb that ladder in under 60 seconds or whatever. And if a 60-year-old can do it, then they can do the job. And so there should be no discrimination. Pregnancy Discrimination Act, this is kind of a carry forward of a lot of the gender discrimination. Employers in the past would discriminate against pregnant people because of having to take more time off, wanting some paid leave, maybe being not, the perception is they're not as productive because they may not be able to physically do some of the aspects of the job. And but the law does exist, it still exists, and you may not discriminate based on somebody's status of being pregnant. Family Medical Leave Act actually is fairly young, as you can see now, young to me, but old to you. So, almost 30 years ago, this law was passed, excuse me, and basically says that you have to provide up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave to care for family members without losing your job. So what does that mean? In the past, if a family member got sick and you had to take care of that family member, not only might you get fired, all right, well, you would get fired. Some employers would keep you, but you get fired. Hey, I've got to take care of my parents are getting elderly, just like I'm doing right now. And employers have to provide up to 12 weeks. Now, I'm lucky. I have a job where I can use up sick days, and I can, take that time to take care of my parents and still get paid. But the law says the employer doesn't have to pay you, all right, but they can't terminate your job, all right, because you're going to be gone for an extensive period of time. Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA. Quite often you'll hear it referred to as FMLA. One that I talked about in class a week or so ago, I did a little, when you guys did your presentations, I did a sample presentation on the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed, as you can see in the picture, by the older George Bush. And basically says that you can't discriminate against people who are disabled. Now, there's a lot of controversy that followed this act because, there's some gray area in, for example, what is a disability and what are reasonable accommodations. In my lecture, I talked about things like, alcoholism specifically wouldn't be covered as a disability, but some forms of emotional instability or emotional disease or psychiatric care, those might fall under disability. Obvious ones, of course, are things like being in wheelchairs or being blind or deaf. Those are all, of course, disabilities. And then, sometimes you just won't be able to make reasonable accommodations. Like if a blind person applies to be a police officer, I don't care how much accommodation that you try to provide a blind person to be a police officer, that's just not going to work. So, that, of course, they wouldn't force a police department to hire a blind person. But one of the examples I gave you in class was like, for example, what if you're a telephone operator and could you pay maybe $1,000 or a reasonable expense to hire a blind person, and making an accommodation be a Braille typewriter? And I think I showed you a picture of what those look like. Yes, that would be an example of the reasonable accommodation. Or to say I'm not hiring this person because they're in a wheelchair and my business is have steps at the front door of my business. And I'd have to, oh my gosh, I'd have to build a ramp and pay for a ramp. I can't do that. I'm not going to hire you. Well, that would fall, that's a prime example of how the Americans with Disabilities Act would work, is you'd have to make a reasonable accommodation to hire this person. Build a ramp. So here's the Hooters example I was talking to you earlier, bona fide occupational qualification. I think I did a pretty good job of explaining BFOQ. I think you guys understand that. One of the things that is very difficult in this gray area is when a company is being blatantly discriminatory, everybody understands that. I mean, that's bad. That's against the law. We actually call that disparate treatment. All right, the word I've got up on the screen here is disparate impact. Disparate treatment is when you're being discriminatory. Maybe you are sexist against women in your workplace, or maybe you are racist against blacks in your workplace. That's disparate treatment. I'm treating you badly. I'm treating you differently than everybody else. Disparate impact is when you can't really prove any outward, or overt, visible discrimination, but the impact, the numbers show that there's something wrong. There's some sort of discrimination going on. And like, let's say, for example, nobody's ever come out and said that my factory discriminates against blacks. And I just hire people, and maybe some of my people that I have hired, my hiring managers have been discriminatory, but they're so good at it. They know how to find ways to make sure that this person isn't hired, or that type of person isn't hired. And so over the years, maybe in my local geography, my town where my factory is, I gave this example about affirmative action, maybe it's 75% black, all right? Let's use the city of Detroit. Let's say my factory is in the city of Detroit, 75% black. Yet my factory is 75% white employees. And so you say, if the town that this factory is in is mostly black, but I've got mostly white employees, what they're saying is that there must be a disparate impact, this term up here, disparate impact, that we don't really need to show the actual discrimination, but we can see on paper the impact. 75% of your population is black, but 75% of your employees are white. And so there must have been some discrimination in the past, discrimination that we just haven't been able to catch, or it's been severely coincidental over the years, but it's something that we need to try to fix, and that's where that affirmative action concept comes into play. But again, you are allowed to discriminate based on BFOQs, and we have to watch for this disparate impact. If somebody can show a disparate impact, that does open you up for a lawsuit. So you're going to want to try and fix those ratios yourself. Even if you weren't overtly discriminating against this particular black candidate, maybe this other candidate was a much better candidate, and you went with the white candidate over the black candidate, right? If you have a disparate impact situation, the black employee, the black applicant is going to have a lot of ammunition to be able to sue your company. And so this is the term disparate impact. It's usually in conjunction with disparate treatment. And Michigan is one of the few states, and again, the laws have changed over the years since I made this slideshow, but specifically Michigan is one of the only states to prohibit height and weight discrimination. And so if you're overweight, or if you are a certain height, and it has nothing to do, there's no BFOQ with regards to height or weight, then they cannot discriminate against you. If the gentleman in this picture, this fireman in the picture, is overweight, by God, he can climb those ladders, the top of that ladder with 50 pounds on his back in under 60 seconds, then there should be no reason to discriminate against that person. You've seen, I'm sure many of you have seen overweight police officers, all right? So you can't just say, hey, we are firing you for being overweight, or we're firing you for being too short. The company's defense would be a BFOQ. They'd have to prove, look, this person needs to be a good police officer. You need to be able to run fast. You need to be able to climb ladders. You need to be able to whatever it might be. So if you can prove a BFOQ, that's your defense. But you can't just say, well, you are overweight or underweight, or you are certain height, and we're going to discriminate against you. Now, There was also another very famous employment case with the airline industry. The airline industry used to use weight as a qualification to be a flight attendant. Formerly, they used to be called stewardesses because it was a female-dominated job. And there were lawsuits. Right? They changed the terminology to flight attendant. But the seats, the aisleways in airplanes are very, very skinny. If you've ever been on an airplane, to be able to walk down through those aisleways, you can't be a severely overweight person. And so they were able to use a BFOQ and say, look, yes, we discriminate against overweight people, but only because you have to be a certain weight to be able to walk down through the aisle of the seats in the plane. So, again, if you can prove a BFOQ, a bona fide occupational qualification, that is the employer's defense against a discrimination case. So generally, height and weight are not going to be something that is a BFOQ. Sexual orientation, I had mentioned this before. I'm not going to get into this in great deal, but it seems like I want to really look at the very bottom. In the Army, there was President Clinton, a Democrat, had come up with a policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We're not going to, and it was a gradual changing, and we've had conservative and liberal presidents, and I just saw in the news that President Biden had just overturned an executive order by President Trump with regards to transgendered soldiers. And they're now, with the Biden administration, back allowed to be in the Army versus not allowed, whether you were gay or not, for basically since the beginning of the history of our Army. If you were gay, that was something that specifically your sexual orientation could disqualify you from being in the Army. And the question is it a BFOQ? And so that's a tough one, because you'd say somebody might, well, soldiers have to live in tight quarters and they may have to get dressed and undressed, and do you want a gay man in your male barracks, those sorts of things. And so there were attempts by the Army to say, hey, it is a BFOQ, and versus, really, that's not a big deal sort of situation. And so Clinton had this don't ask, don't tell. We're not going to ask you if you're gay, but don't tell us. If you tell us you're gay, then we're going to kick you out. And that was interesting. That was overturned by several presidents a little bit later. This is a GIF, G-I-F, that kind of shows how sexual orientation and gender identity, being gay or transgendered, has changed with specific laws. Now remember, there's no federal protection for these things. And so these things have to be on a state-by-state basis. And you will start to see some, by the way, this, you see Michigan lighting up on sexual orientation, light blue, but that would be if you're employed by the state of Michigan, not all employers, like restaurants and private sector employers. And again, this chart goes to about the late 90s, I believe, and then ends 2000, 2001, 2002, 4, 5, maybe I was wrong, maybe the late 2000s. Anyway, yeah. So this graphic is a little bit behind the times as well. And there's 2017's update. And I'm not going to make you memorize any of this stuff, but what you do need to know is that sexual orientation is not a federally protected class, and so therefore it has been protected at the state level. And you will see that it depends on the political leanings. A lot of your Republican states in the midsection in the South don't have protection for sexual orientation, and your more liberal states on the East Coast and the West Coast are the ones that do pass those laws. So here's your article review assignment. So I'm going to just quickly review it for you, and I'll also give you some instructions on this in Google Classroom as well. So I want you to find just an article that deals with employment discrimination, anything that we've touched upon. And there's some sample categories that you can see down there. Get this out of the way. 1964 Civil Rights Act, age discrimination, weight discrimination, BFOQs, pregnancy, sexual harassment, all kinds of stuff there. And just pick a topic. Follow the directions. You're going to find an article, use Google News, the news button on the Google search. Should be able to find something fairly recent, and you will summarize the article, 1 to 2 paragraphs typed, and then you will give your opinion, 1 to 2 paragraphs typed. You can find something about particular types of violations or particular companies that you know have violated. Walmart has been sued on actually many occasions for sex discrimination. Don't quote me on the exact percentages, but for example, something like 70% of all employees of Walmart are females. But then it's the opposite, like 70% of their managers are males. And so one might argue, Walmart would argue, well, males just are natural leaders. Females are going to say, no, that's horse poop. Right? They're not. You're discriminating against women. And if most of your workforce is female, you would logically expect that a near similar percentage would be the bosses, would be the managers. And so these are the sorts of things that I'd like you to look for, search for, find nice, cool stuff and recent stuff with regards to any of these types of topics. That is it for today. And I am going to say goodbye. Tomorrow during asynchronous time, you are going to do this article review. And when I see you next week, Monday, we're going to do those article reviews in class.